Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
My name is Lowell Midla, and I'm a veterinarian. Practiced for 24 years. Part of that time was at the vet school at the Ohio State University. About 8 years ago, I joined Merk Animal Health. Gives me some extra time to work with good folks like Jerry Yates and the other good folks at WVU Extension. So Jerry asked me to share some thoughts this evening, so let's jump right into it. We're going to talk a little bit about stress and why I hate the term stress. Talk a little bit about managing calves through drought, managing cows through drought, managing gestating calves through drought. And then if we have time, a little bit about working with your veterinarian. So I personally hate the term stress. So anytime you hear anyone say stress causes X, whatever, what that really means is they don't know. They don't know what causes it. They just make it up that stress causes it because they don't know the answer yet. And a great example is gastric ulcers in people, right? You know, in 1960 or 70 or 80, even if you had a gastric ulcer and went to the doctor, your doctor would say, well, you're under too much stress. There was a physician, microbiologist in Australia named Barry Marshall, who wrote a paper. He had isolated a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori from people with ulcers. And he wrote a paper about that, and the medical community, totally rejected that and said, you're full of it, Dr. Marshall, you don't know what you're talking about. So then he drank an elixir of those bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, and he got an ulcer. And then with antibiotics, in about 14 days, it went away. And he wrote a paper about that, and the medical community refused to believe him. But then over time, people started to realize that, yes, and this is not all cases of gastric ulcer in people, but yes, many, if not most cases of gastric ulcers in people are caused by a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, not by stress. And if we were all together in a meeting room, I would ask you right now, what is another name for pneumonia in cattle? What is the layman's term? And the answer is shipping fever, right? Well, is it the shipping per se that gives them pneumonia? No. What it is, though, is the stereotypical calf that's weaned off the cow by the method of taking the calf to the sale barn, and then it's transported 1,800 miles to Nebraska, and when it arrives at the feedlot, it's castrated and dehorned, and it's never seen a water trough ever before in its life. It's only knows how to drink from the creek. I'm from the Southwest Pennsylvania, and that's close enough to West Virginia. It's a creek in my lexicon. Only ever knew how to drink from the creek. It has no idea what that metal thing over the corner of the pen is. Right. So the point is, we're piling on stressors. Stressors, I understand what those are. I can put a name on those things. Stress is a nebulous thing that just basically means I don't know. So I promise we'll get to drought in a moment. Regarding this concept of stressors, and a related concept is that of the disease triangle. And this actually originated out of plant pathology. But the point of the disease triangle is that no one of these things, between the host, and that's obviously the cow or the calf or the animal, the pathogen, that's the bug, say IBR or Mannheimia hemolytica, and the environment, it's like a three-legged stool. No one leg is more important. If any leg on a three-legged stool fails, then the entire stool fails. And so the host, for example, if the calf didn't get adequate colostrum, or the calf is selenium deficient, the host cannot withstand even a mild disease challenge. if there is an overwhelming number of bugs, right? The calf is born into the manure slop in March, an overwhelming number of bugs. That's going to overwhelm even a normal host, or the environment, right? For example, roofs, barns, cattle breathing the same air is a risk factor for pneumonia. The point is, all three though are equal, and many veterinarians and many producers focus way too much on the pathogen. What's the bug? Got to know the bug. Can we vaccinate it against the bug? Well, the bug is important, but the host and the environment are just as important. So an example for pneumonia, or BRD, bovine respiratory disease in cattle, is shown here, right? With vaccination, for example, being in green on the left, under the host, meaning we vaccinate to make the host just a little bit more resistant. But also note that vaccination is on the right, because all vaccines are at least a little bit of a stressor. And I can give you several examples of that, but in the interest of time, I won't. But some vaccines more so than others. For example, intranasal vaccines are typically less of a stressor than sub-Q vaccines, and modified live are typically a little bit less than killed vaccines because they have to put so much antigen in killed to stimulate an immune response. But all of these things are potential ways that the animal can fail and develop pneumonia. So the point of all this is, do not pile on multiple stressors on the same day. And we're here to talk about drought. Drought is just an additional stressor. That's what it is. Certainly, heat is not drought per se, but we've sure seen our fair share of heat in Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia this year. And that is a stressor, right? Many of our cattle, particularly our Angus, Hereford base, Angus and Herefords are from Scotland and England. Those are sort of northern climate adapted cattle, definitely not southern climate adapted cattle. And then, of course, dehydration. I just took a photograph. I was home at our farm in Southwest Pennsylvania over the weekend, and I have never seen our creek in our valley stop running. And I took a picture of a dry cattle trail down through the creek. Right, we are short of water. We may have to start hauling water. And obviously, the big one is inadequate calories. Right, not enough grass, not enough food, not enough feed, not enough intake. That can be a stressor. And then finally, dust that can compromise the lungs and make them more susceptible to pneumonia. And so there's obvious interventions, right? For the heat, we should provide shade, we should provide water, and we should provide supplemental feed. Well, that's easy for a vet boy to sit in his chair and say, right? But it costs money. I get that. So hopefully tonight we'll talk about maybe some alternatives to just providing more feed, right? Going out and buying hay. But remember, too, though, that it is our responsibility as stewards of the animals under our care to make sure that they do not have to withstand intense hardship, right? If they need feed, we have to supplement it. So what can we do for the calves? So remember the agenda. We're going to talk about calves, and we're going to talk about cows. So obviously creep feeding, right, is a way to get around that. And I'm sure many of you creep feed generally, even in good years, just to add pounds of calf to sell. But definitely in a drought situation, creep feeding they're plenty old enough to wean. And they're going to gain more as long as you do it properly. They're hopefully going to gain more once you wean them and they're in the dry lot and you're feeding them an appropriate ration than they are out there on the drought-stressed pasture with mama. Secondly, if you wean them now, you can sell those calves as preconditioned, right? The typical number is 45 days in order to qualify for most programs, but even longer is better. And if you vaccinate them now, then you can put them on the superior sale or take them to or contact the order buyer and sell a lot of preconditioned calves, and that'll get you more money for sure. We have data gathered primarily from Superior over the last several years, but preconditioning pays. And the other thing is, that preconditioning doesn't only pay because of the nickel or so more you get per pound, but preconditioning mostly pays because they have gained more pounds in the last 45 days and you're selling more pounds. And then finally, preconditioned calves will do better for the buyer, right? And you want to sell them to that person again next year. So weaning those calves now. In fact, at home we're going to do that. We don't typically wean for another month and a half, and we are preparing to wean calves here in the next few days. Obviously, you have to feed them, but I checked, and yesterday corn was $3.85 a bushel. You can afford to feed them this year. But the little asterisk on all this is if these are drought stressed calves that are not properly prepared for weaning, we could have trouble. So let's talk a little bit about preparing calves for weaning. Very important is to start them on feed. And obviously, you can do that just with creep feeding. But if you do it just with creep feeding, you need to give it adequate time to make sure all of the calves are started, right? Because what's going to happen the first few days, those big dominant calves or hungry calves or calves that just like the feed are going to get in there. But we need all of the calves to be started on feed. So it takes about probably 2 weeks to ensure that all calves are started. You might even have to push a few calves into the creep feeder just to be sure. An alternative is to just put a pipe across a gate between two fields. And the first day, you'll need to call the cows and calves down, and it'll take a moment or two to push the calves under the pipe. But after the second or third day, the cows know the program. You need to give the cows a bite of feed too, so they'll bring the calves every day. But after a few days, everybody knows the program. You obviously have to have adequate bunk space for all the calves to eat. But if you do that, even just for 7 days ahead of weaning, that will pay big dividends. And then obviously vaccination, right? We want to vaccinate these calves. Weaning, if you look over there on the right, weaning is probably the biggest risk factor for BRD or pneumonia. Of all the stressors, weaning is the most likely time to get pneumonia in these calves. And vaccination can certainly help to prevent that. If you're given a killed vaccine, you need to give 2 rounds of vaccine, both a dose and a booster, with the second dose at least 2 weeks prior to weaning. And I realize if you start that today, then it's going to be another month before you can wean them. But definitely giving some vaccine prior to weaning. I would recommend modified live vaccine in those calves at least 2 weeks prior to weaning. Do not do it at weaning. So notice, I mentioned before that vaccination is always a stressor, right? So we do not want to vaccinate on the day of weaning. That's just adding another stressor onto the stress of weaning. And then finally, these nose weaner thingamabobbers, we have started to use those. So I'll just skip to the next slide and tell you our little story. We do fence line weaning, and fence line weaning is the best. If you can't do fence line weaning, the best thing to do is haul the calves far enough away from the cows so they can't hear each other at night. The worst is if the cows and calves can hear each other but can't see each other. But we did fence line weaning, and some years we would get away and be fine, but other years we'd treat up to 20%, one in 5 calves for BRD being bovine respiratory disease or pneumonia. So some years we would have a wreck. Well, I don't know how many years we might even have been doing this for 20 years, and we don't creep feed our calves, but we do, as I described earlier, start those calves on feed for about 10 days prior to weaning, and it takes a little work, admittedly, and then we put those weaner things in their nose about 5 days prior, and we have essentially, every year I ask my brother, I said, did you have to treat anything this year? And he can't remember ever, and when I say essentially no pneumonia, he can't remember ever treating any since we've started doing this. Part of the point being that we can't change the drought. What we can change is the things we do. And cattle get things like BRD or pneumonia in large part to the stressors that humans impose on the cattle. So why not change what we do and then not have pneumonia? It's amazing that we really haven't treated a calf in 15 to 20 years. When you wean them, Obviously, and I'm a simple country veterinarian. I am not a nutritionist. I'm not gonna. I don't call me to tell you exactly what ration, but the point is just not too much finely ground corn. If they've been on grass and that's all they've ever seen, and they go on to too much starch too quickly, that's obviously a problem, right? So not too hot a ration and palatable hay. It doesn't have to be, third cutting 22% protein alfalfa. It just has to be green. They just have to eat it. Second cut grass hay is perfect, green, so they eat it, palatable. The other thing is water. And I could go through a 10-minute explanation of how critical water is for immune function. But just trust me, water is critically important for immune function. Those immune cells that find the bugs, dendritic cells that find the bad guys and have to take them to a lymph node in order for the immune system to get started, that all happens much more slowly in a dehydrated animal. So, again, if those calves have never seen a Ritchie fountain or one of those things, with the balls they have to push down to get water, just go to Walmart and buy little kiddie swimming pools or other tubs of some sort and put them in the pen. The more these calves drink, the less susceptible they are to disease. So a trick I learned from Dr. Tara Felix at Penn State was that these calves, this is either stocker cattle receiving or weaned calves, they tend to circle, right? They circle the pens. So put that hay and water around the periphery of the pen, and they're going to waste some hay. They're going to trample it. Smile, like it, because that will pay. Because if they're walking by and they take a bite of it, that'll keep them on feed and keep them eating. And then finally, don't wean calves in a barn, not even under any roof of any sort. When cattle are breathing the same air, they are more susceptible to BRD or pneumonia. And then finally, deworm them, right? We could deworm prior to weaning, but then they're still going to be grazing up new parasites from the pasture for those next few days. So I would deworm right at weaning when they come off pasture into the dry lot. Remember, pasture is the risk. That's where the eggs are. So I would deworm at weaning. I don't know if you've ever seen these barns that have the slate roofs where they put, the date the barn was built on the top of the roof in with different color slate tiles. What I would suggest is all barns should just have 666 on the top, because barns were designed by the devil to give cattle pneumonia. That's what barns are for. Anytime cattle are under a roof, they're much more likely to develop pneumonia. So what about cows? You should be preg checking your cows every year. That is the single greatest cost benefit thing that a veterinarian can do for you, or you can just run the blood test. I don't care. But the biggest cost incurred on a beef cow calf operation is feed. Most of that is incurred in West Virginia in the wintertime when we're feeding them over winter. And if we're feeding a cow over winter that's not going to give us a paycheck in the form of a calf in the spring, we have wasted that money. So cull open cows, late calvers now before we invest that money. And the other thing is, if you do it now, that's more pasture for the cows that stay. The other thing is body condition scoring. So cows, there's 365 days in a year, and heifers, first lactation, first calf heifers should be body condition score 6 on the day of calving, because that will lessen the number of days to first estrus. And really, we want them to have gone through an estrus and breed them on the second estrus. So body condition scoring on the day of calving is critical, but you can't fix that on the day of calving. You need to start fixing that now or soon, so that we have them in the right body condition score on the day of calving. And so weaning the calves off, removing that energy drain of lactation helps. The other thing you can do is, if you ask yourselves these two questions, do I have the ability in facilities, time, and feed to make two cow groups, a thin cow group and a fat cow group, and separate them? And do I have enough thin cows to make it worth the effort? If you do, then do it and feed those thin cows a little better. And that will next year affect your ability to get those cows pregnant so that they have calves at the right time the following year. It starts right now today, not next spring, not later. It starts today. Body condition scoring is not at all difficult. It's basically look at the cow from the side. If you can't see any ribs, she's a 6 or better. If you see 1 to 2 ribs, she's a body condition score 5. And it's always the hindmost rib, right? The 12th and 13th rib in the back, toward the tail of the cow. If you can see those last 2 ribs, she's a 5. And if you can see more than 2 ribs, she's a 4 or less. So that's simple body condition scoring 101. Cows need to be a 5, heifers need to be a 6 or better. So body condition scoring is totally simple. Anyone can do it, but you need to do it today and then act upon those results. So a couple more things, just sort of the easy things. Temporary electric fence. At our farm we own a big long valley, and the tops of the hills of the pasture aren't grazed, and the bottom land down by the creek is grazed like a putting green on a golf course. You can take some temporary electric fence to make some strips, get a solar charger, and sort of divide those cows off to make them go up and graze the top of the hill. The other thing is just a couple of pounds of corn, right? Corn is cheap right now. A couple of pounds of corn goes a long way. Lots of energy in corn. Obviously, start them on it slowly, but a couple of pounds of corn goes a long way. And then finally, minimize feed waste, right? If you've been thinking about buying a hay saver, brown bale feeder, or some other thing, this might be the year to do it because you don't have extra hay. Minimizing feed waste. And those are all things you should probably be doing anyway. Some more outside of the box things are, alternate feedstuffs, maybe some distillers or grocery store waste. The other thing is, it's not dry everywhere. They have had rain in some places, but, hay's going to go up. I predict that it will. I don't know. I'm not an economist, but buy hay now. And then finally, you might have to put cows in a dry lot, and just put them on corn, a little bit of hay to keep their rumen healthy, but it can be done. So one more little thing. So I mentioned we're going to talk about calves, we're going to talk about cows, and then we're going to talk about gestating calves. So gestating calves are the fetuses that are inside your cows right now, for those calves that are going to be born next spring. So I always like to understand something. So just run through this briefly for the nerds among you. Right. So Animal Science 101 is genotype plus environment equals phenotype. Genotype is the genes, the DNA. Environment obviously is, right now we're talking about drought. And then phenotype is what they look like, how much they weigh, how big they are, are they red or are they black? All those are what they are, their phenotype. My phenotype is 6'3", male and ugly. Molecular Biology 101. This is sort of the central dogma of the biochemical basis of life. What I was taught in biology 40 years ago is DNA gets transcribed into messenger RNA, and our messenger RNA gets transcribed into protein, and then proteins is what makes us, right? A structural protein like collagen or bone or muscle, or a functional protein. Like a signal messenger, a cytokine, or GnRH is a reproductive hormone. But it's a protein. It's only 10 amino acids. So what we thought was, if we combine that Animal Science 101 and Molecular Biology 101, that the DNA sequence plus environment that's the whole thing. And it turns out that there's this other thing called epigenetic effects. So it's not just the DNA sequence. Basically, epigenetics is heritable changes that are not the result of that sequence, the GCAT sequence. You may have heard the term fetal programming. Well, that's epigenetics. And there's some biochemical reasons this happens, but basically it regulates if we regulate when the DNA is turned on and how the intensity of the turning on when it is turned on, that can affect how we grow, particularly as you are forming the organs, as you're forming muscle and the liver and those things inside your mama as a fetus. And so that's sort of the big thing about epigenetics, is it affects us primarily, not exclusively, but primarily as we're a developing fetus when you turn on the DNA, not just the DNA sequence. So it results in phenotypic plasticity with regard to a fixed DNA sequence. The point of why am I telling why do you care? Like I'm sure people's eyes have glazed over in the last 4 minutes. Well, what matters is maternal nutrient status during gestation can cause epigenetic alteration to this genome, and that is heritable and it impacts future generations. Epigenetic changes are passed on to the next generation. So not only will these calves that are inside mamas right now be affected, but also potentially and probably those calves, and those calves, right? And it affects survivability, morbidity, and mortality as neonates. Whether or not they get or die from scours, postnatal growth rate, weaning weight. A lot of this work has been done on carcass traits, so muscling and marbling are affected by epigenetics pretty dramatically. Reproductive efficiency, let's say there's a heifer calf inside that cow right now. She went through drought. That heifer, it affects how well she's able to get pregnant as a yearling, and can even affect her daughter's ability to get pregnant. But it's important to note that both undernutrition and overnutrition can have epigenetic effects, right? So really the Goldilocks approach is best. So let's say it's next year, it's not a drought, but you remember this. It's kind of like Goldilocks. The porridge can't be too hot, too cold. It just needs to be just right. So really, you need to kind of keep your cows, gestating calves, on a plane of nutrition that's roughly equal to that of your normal environment. You want cows, the key in a commercial cow calf operation is to have a cow calf herd that's adapted to your local environment. They can survive and thrive and get pregnant and wean a fat calf in your environment under your environmental conditions. So one last little note is toxicities. Jimson weed is, if you look at heavy use areas, corrals and places like that, feeding areas, you might have Jimson weed. It can kill cattle, but I've seen cattle, we have Jimson weed all through a couple of our, heavy use areas, and I've never seen an animal eat it or die from it. But, when they get hungry, that's when you need to start to worry. And so if your cattle are hungry, that's when you need to worry about how many acorns are out underneath the oak trees, how much Jimson weed. Buckeye is typically a spring thing, but I could see it happening in the fall. So, and then finally, you need to watch the neighbors that trim their yew bushes. Yew bushes are evergreens. They don't typically plant them anymore, but historically around, they're a little shrub around houses. And it's the most common toxicity I've seen as a veterinarian is the neighbor or even the cattle owner, trims their yew bush and they say, "Oh, I bet the cows would like these," and they throw them over the fence. And it only takes a small handful of yew needles to kill a cow. And I mean a literal handful will kill a cow dead. I mean, not slightly dead, all dead. Finally, one more thing, nitrates. Corn grown under drought can be high in nitrates. Most of the nitrates in a corn plant are near the bottom. So if you raise the chop height of your corn silage, raise where the chopper chops it, from let's say 6 inches up to 1.5 feet, you're greatly decreasing the potential for nitrate toxicity. But again, I'm a veterinarian. You should talk to your agronomist or your extension agent regarding having the corn silage tested or the appropriate height to raise it. Really, we tend to use veterinarians for emergency work, right? We have a prolapsed uterus or a calving dystocia, calving problem, calving difficulty. That is the least return on investment for your vet. Pregnancy checks and breeding soundness exams and, setting up your vaccination program, that is the greatest cost return on investment or benefit to cost ratio that you can use a veterinarian for. So find a vet who likes cows. I know it's hard. I know you're going to tell me it's hard. You can't find one. Yes, you can. Look harder. Find a vet who likes cows, and then don't be afraid to pay them and smile when you write the check. So the take-home messages: don't ever say stress causes anything ever again. Please, I beg you. There are stressors that we can put a name on, like dehorning and castration and weaning, and it's up to you to creep feed your calves or wean them early. Preg check, then cull open cows, body condition score cows, and then supplement thin cows, and then do the things you should be doing better and consider some new things regarding this drought deal. And then finally, this epigenetics thing means that the effects of drought are not just on those existing cows and calves, but potentially on future generations as well.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.